Earl Miller is among the last of his generation here at Plum Creek. And as Rob described, he was part of the greatest generation. What made that generation so great was that they were born into simple, humble homes, didn't expect much out of life, but were happy and content with what they did have. They sacrificed their years after high school for our country. And then they came back and had the faith and the fortitude to start families, even though we were facing the threat of nuclear war from communism. They raised their children, we baby boomers, in the midst of the greatest social changes in American history. They became the leaders of business and industry. They taught us, baby boomers, how to work with their integrity and their diligence. And they kept a sense of humor about the world in which they lived. It had changed so much during their lifetimes, and they learned to adapt and change with it. And during their lifetimes, this country became the greatest country on earth, and prosperity abounded because of their efforts. Dutch Miller was but one from that generation. For those of us who loved him, who knew him, who appreciated what he gave us and what value he has left us, he embodied the greatest generation. So it didn't surprise me, Rob, that you chose that from Tom Brokaw. I had written all about that in preparing for our service today. Dutch was born on the Sabbath day. It was Sunday when he was born, March 5, 1922, the first of 3 children to Joe and Mildred Lott Miller. Joe was an oil and gas well driller who originally lived in Unity, and Mildred was one of the Lotts from Center. Their home on New Texas Road lay between the Mallacy farm and the road, next to the Roops, where his lifelong friend Dee Dee lived. Lulu Davidson from the farm across the road would walk Dutch to church when he was a little lad in his knickerbockers. And when he was a teenager, he and Dee Dee would work on the Mallacy farm, feeding cows and chickens for 20 cents a day. On thrashing days, the boys in the neighborhood would gather at Charlie Mallacy's barn, and they would help with the hay, the baling of the hay, and women would fashion a hearty meal for all the workers. It was a vivid experience of the harvest that was foretold in the scriptures, about which he had heard in the old sanctuary that he knew as Plum Creek as a child. It reminded the faithful Presbyterians of God's final harvest on the resurrection day. This was the Presbyterian culture of Plum Creek's oldest families. The sun shining across the fields of the Davidson and Mallacy and McLaughlin and McJunkin farms was in stark contrast with the mining culture beneath those agricultural fields. Dutch and his friends worked all of the farms through the summers, and when they weren't working in the brilliance of the abundance of God's harvest, they were having fun beneath Plum Township's soil. The Plum Creek mine, you might remember, extends from Center all the way out to the Westmoreland County line underneath Saltsburg Road. And at the Laird Church intersection of New Texas and Saltsburg Road stood another mine that was closer to the surface, the Cribbs Mine. Its mine shaft sat across the road from the McJunkin farm, not far from the Laird Cemetery where the original Plum Creek was. And Dutch and his friends didn't need Kennywood to build a mine ride for them. They had it there at the Cribbs Mine. mule-drawn coal cars would sit outside of the mine at the end of the day, and these boys would all jump on the cars and take turns pushing themselves through the mine underneath what we now know as woodland estates, about 20 feet below those homes that have now been built there. That was part of their summer fun. When he wasn't exploring the local mine, Dutch was cutting the grass around Plum Creek Cemetery and then sledding down the hill in the winters across the creek. It was a world of innocence, even though things were changing overseas. This was the world of Dutch's Great Depression. It was a joyful time. It wasn't a time in which he thought about economic hardship. It was a time of fun, a time of relishing the goodness of God's abundance and the families of the church who were his friends. Dutch wouldn't talk about what he didn't have. He was thankful for what he did have. And I think a lot of the folks from that generation understood that. He and Dee Dee would dutifully listen to the warnings from the Women's Christian Temperance Union about excessive use of alcohol, the dangers that would require prohibition here in Plum Creek Sanctuary, and then they would take Dee Dee's Ford from Nesbitt's garage and drive down to New Kensington to the Ritz and the Liberty Theaters with their dates, and then they would go to the American Drink Shop where they would have fun. The rural world of Plum was changing. Industry was taking over the quiet of the East Hills, and one of Dutch's girlfriends, Hetty McDade, was the daughter of a Union Railroad supervisor. Hetty's father got Dutch a job at the railroad's roundhouse, and he was sweeping floors for 17 cents an hour. It would begin a lifelong career with the Union Railroad at the Hall Roundhouse in Wilkins Township. And when Dutch finally retired as the supervisor of the diesel engines, he had made a career without a college degree. He had risen from the bottom up through his integrity, his industry, his intelligence, and his capacity to be a friend to everyone that he met. It was a simple ethic, really, taken from the teachings of Jesus Christ. And when Dutch graduated from Wilkinsburg High School in 1940, he was already working for the Union Railroad. He wasn't that concerned about what was happening overseas. In fact, he told me that when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, he wasn't worried about it. It seemed so far away. He had a job. He had already begun dating Alwyn Shearer, whose home was in Upper Borough, and he had met Alwyn on a double date with Don Swires, and she had been Don's date that night. But Dutch decided to invite Alwyn to go with him to Kennywood Park, and their date began a lifelong relationship for Dutch and Alwyn. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Air Force, and he and Alwyn agreed to write each other as he entered the service, but she had been dating other fellows. Dutch cemented her interest when he unexpectedly came home and arrived at a USO dance that she was volunteering at in Upper Borough. And the way he describes it, he was doing this just before he was ready to go overseas. The music stopped at the very second he entered the door. And there he was in his Air Force uniform, in all of his glory. It must have made quite an impression on Alwyn. But these were the days when that generation's character was forged. Dutch talked to me at length, as Rob said, all of us knew about his service for his country. If you've ever read The Fly Boys, you will understand that those who entered the Air Force had already begun hearing about the stories of the Japanese atrocities that they would do against captured American flyers, and Dutch knew about that. He assumed he would be flying over open oceans where help would be far away if his plane was disabled. And he was willing to do that for you and me to be sitting here today in freedom. Dutch became a pilot with the 5th Air Force, and he, as you've already heard, flew B-24s with the 90th Bomb Squadron, or 90th Bomb Group, 321st Squadron. And this is a time when a man's heart is measured. There was a passage that he told me about that he remembered from church. It was from Deuteronomy 31, 8 through 10. It's the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. And so he kept that as a thought, that the Lord would be before him as he would leave us for overseas. And the Reverend Jack Little, who is the pastor here at Plum Creek, promised to write Dutch through the war, and they formed a lifelong relationship. And Dutch began to memorize the 23rd Psalm. He said to me, "There's nothing like a war to make a man religious." He was preparing himself for what lay ahead. He was trying to get ahead of whatever it was he was going to have to face. He was determined to do his part to defend his family, his girlfriend, his church friends he loved. But he knew that his future lay in the Lord's keeping. Dutch flew bombing missions over Yap and Peleliu and Davao in the Philippines, and he attacked Japanese positions at Corregidor and Manila, and even flew into China and attacked the aerodrome there in Canton. He bombed Saigon before it was known to us during the Vietnam War. And through it all, his B-24s were protected by an invisible hand. He described how the flak from anti-aircraft guns would rarely penetrate his planes. He was more concerned about them being properly cared for by the mechanics on the field than he was about the Japanese fighters. And after Hiroshima, he was sent to fly over that city that was first to experience the atomic bomb for an aerial reconnaissance mission in which they took photographs of that destruction. And he came away humbled by what he had seen and what it would take to bring an end to the war. And he was there at Okinawa to see the Japanese delegation get off their planes when they began to negotiate with us, with General MacArthur, for peace. So Dutch was protected by God's hand, and he knew it. The Lord had been way ahead of Dutch to clear the way for his safety. And too many times that Dutch flew planes that were disrepair with instruments that were faulty led him that he wasn't going to trust them anymore. He believed it was only God's providence that had made it possible for him to come back home, and he didn't want to push God's envelope any farther. So he took a ship back from the Pacific because he didn't want to fly anymore. And he turned down the opportunity to be a commercial pilot so that he could go back to the railroad and stay closer to the ground. World War II, as we know, made a tremendous impression upon Dutch and all of his generation. He wasn't one who really was all that interested in global politics. He was a family man, and what he did for his family. And he did it all because he understood the meaning of God's grace. It was by God's grace that he was allowed to return as a son. to become a husband, to become a father. How he lived upon his return as a son, as a husband and a father, and as a friend reflected his joy in being the great recipient of God's grace. He was thankful for his friends from church being able to make it back home. Dee Dee and Jack and the Nesbitts and all the others who had fought overseas. Each would go their own way in life and have their own families, but they would all be back here at church on Sundays, thankful for what God had done for them. And then Dutch joined Bill Summers and Walt Clements and Murray Thompson and Howard Lamont and Paul Ritter and Russ Nesbitt on the baseball diamond for the church, when the church had a baseball team. He had known them during the war. He had seen Jack Lott overseas there in Biak, and he was close to all of those men with whom he had grown up. And there was in the old sanctuary a great mural of Jesus with his arms upstretched that would greet them all upon their return, showing them that God's providence was always with them. And they were reminded of that. So that when Gary and Elaine and Nancy were born in the afterglow of those monumental years, they experienced a man of joy who celebrated life to its fullest because of what God had given to him. And when he and Alwyn were married at Markle Presbyterian Church in 1947, they celebrated together that all of those letters had not been in vain. All those prayers that Alwyn had offered had been answered. All those times that Dutch had reflected upon the future were fulfilled by the grace of Jesus Christ. And so he and Alwyn explored life together. They took the train out to California to visit his sister Jean and her family and to visit Alwyn's parents when they moved to Arizona. When Nancy and Bert needed him and Alwyn in Texas, they'd stay close to the ground and drive. In fact, the only time he admiringly looked into the sky was when he was watching one of his beautiful fades land right into the center of the fairway of some golf course. He went with his sister Dottie's husband Art to the Jefferson Rod and Gun Club and with all of his family and friends and told stories that would have the hunting camp laughing into the night. And he would joke with his grandchildren Tyson and Chris and Noel and Lucas and had great delight in his great-grandchildren, Richie and Layla and Bo and McCartney, and was praying for the safe arrival of another great-grandchild as well. For he had been protected by the God, and he trusted in the Lord. And when deer crept into his garden there at Old Block Road, he complained with a smile, for he was thankful. He was aware of his blessings. He had been thinking way ahead about this day that we are celebrating, his arrival in the kingdom of heaven. He had been thinking about it overseas. He had been preparing for it his whole life. He had been teaching his children to be way ahead, to look forward to the kingdom of heaven, to celebrate life in this life with the anticipation of the better life that is to come. And he gave thanks that he would see Alwyn again by God's providence that had sustained him here on earth. And so it's all too easy for us, we baby boomers and later generations, to complain about all the things we don't have, all the things we wish we did have, and to get distracted by all the things that really don't matter. He and Alwyn and all the rest of that generation taught us to be thankful, to give thanks for our children, our grandchildren, for each precious day, and to live life way ahead by keeping our minds on the prize in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.